This is an apocalyptic prophecy about the fate of Jerusalem, a city that has been thoroughly ravaged by the Gentile nations, and whose destruction was designed by God. God had arranged for Babylon, the most powerful Gentile nation at the time, to come upon Jerusalem, not to take it gracefully, but to destroy it. And what does God want to accomplish by doing that? He wants the people to know that through the history of Jerusalem's nobility, as the only place where God's temple was located, and, conversely, through the history of its devastation, that the destiny of Jerusalem is all according to God's will. In other words, everything that happens in Jerusalem is according to God's will and word. In today's passage, we're told that what happens in Jerusalem in the future will be just like the night Israel came out of Egypt. In Exodus 3:20-22, God said, "So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go. And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed toward this people, so that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor, and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and so you will plunder the Egyptians." The idea is that God takes care that the gold and silver and clothing of the Egyptians belong to God's people when Israel exits. In other words, Israel is a moving target with God. And ultimately, Zechariah prophesies that Jerusalem will be the capital of the millennial kingdom. That is, on the day that Jesus, the Messiah, returns, or verse 4, on that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem. And the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley, with half of the mountain moving north and half moving south. And in the day of the Lord's return, that is, in verse 8, on that day, living water will flow out from Jerusalem, half of it east to the Dead Sea and half of it west to the Mediterranean Sea, in summer and in winter. After the Lord's return, living waters will spring up out of Jerusalem and flow into the Mediterranean Sea on the west and the Dead Sea on the east. This is the literal interpretation. When interpreting biblical prophecy, the literal interpretation is the first step. If the literal interpretation doesn't work out, then the next step is to interpret it as a symbol or allegory, which is a common way of interpreting prophecy. But this Zechariah passage says that living water will flow out of Jerusalem at the end of the age with the return of Jesus. But there is a specific parallel passage in Ezekiel chapter 47. When Jesus returns and the temple of the millennial kingdom, the temple of Ezekiel, is completed, water will come out of the threshold of the temple and flow east and west, and the water that flows east to the Dead Sea will become a great river that no man can cross. Ezekiel chapter 47:5. And will bring the Dead Sea to life. Ezekiel 4:7-1-2. Jesus, the source of life, will reign in the temple in Jerusalem, where the living waters will flow and revive the Dead Sea. And this is when the text says in verse 9, "The Lord will be king over the whole earth. On that day there will be one Lord, and his name the only name." The millennial kingdom is a kingdom ruled by Jesus, who is Jehovah I Am, as king of the whole world. With Jesus ruling, the millennial kingdom can only be the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. At that time, we, the bride of Christ, will participate in the rule with the Lord, and Israel will participate in the rule as a nation of priests. And the whole land around Jerusalem will become like Arava, a low plain, and only Jerusalem will be exalted. Isaiah 2:2-3 prophesies that in the end times, Jerusalem, with its temple mountain, will be exalted above all the mountains, not only of Israel but of the nations. In the last days the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths." The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Verse 10 says, "But Jerusalem will be raised up high, and will remain in its place." If verse 9 is a prophecy of Jesus, the King of Kings, ruling the nations from Jerusalem, then verse 11 is about the blessings that will be restored to Jerusalem during the millennial kingdom. In verse 11, it says, "It will be inhabited, never again will it be destroyed." Jerusalem will be secure. God protects Jerusalem to dwell in peace during the millennium. This is shown in Revelation chapter 29, when the dragon, released from the bottomless pit at the end of the millennium, deceives the people everywhere and tries to besiege the city of Jerusalem. But fire came down from heaven and devoured them. The idea is that when the Babylonian and Roman armies besieged Jerusalem, it was a city that could not stand in peace, but when Jesus reigns, Jerusalem will be a safe haven that no army can invade. First, it says that God will judge the enemies who come up against Jerusalem in the last days. In verses 12-15 of today's text, it says, "This is the plague with which the Lord will strike all the nations that fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are still standing on their feet, their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths." 15 A similar plague will strike the horses and mules, the camels and donkeys, and all the animals in those camps. Verses 12-15 of today's passage describe the eschatological war that will be waged against Jerusalem at the end of time. described in verse 13 as on that day. The book of Revelation records 3 great wars. First, there's the war in Revelation chapter 9, where 1/3 of the people are killed. In Revelation chapter 9:15, it says, "And the 4 angels, who had been kept ready for this very hour and day and month and year, were released to kill 1/3 of mankind." This is World War III, which takes place at the time of the 6th trumpet. Before the 7-year tribulation, or during the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, it's said that 1/3 of the people will die. So, with a world population of 8 billion, that's about 2.6 billion or more people. Secondly, there's the War of Armageddon in Revelation chapter 19, is the war between Christ and the Antichrist, during the latter 3.5 years, and it's the war that takes place after the 7th vial is poured out. And then the third is the War of Gog and Magog in Revelation chapter 19, which is the last war of mankind, which takes place after the Millennial Kingdom. Now, the war in verse 12 of our text is World War III, which is a war in which the world's allied armies surround and attack Jerusalem. The motivation for this war is described in Zechariah chapter 12:2-3. "I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. Judah will be besieged as well as Jerusalem, on that day when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her. I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to move it will injure themselves." Jerusalem is home to the Temple Mount, the site of the Old Temple, where Israel's and the Middle East's interests are intertwined. The rock, where Abraham once sacrificed Isaac. The Islamic occupation of the site built the Islamic Dome of the Rock in 691 AD. And the claim that Muhammad ascended to heaven from there, when in fact he died in the arms of his second wife, Aisha, on June 8, 632 AD. The Temple Mount is also home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where pilgrims worship. This was originally a Byzantine church, which was converted into an Islamic mosque. The current building was completed in 1066. Islam considers the Dome of the Rock to be a holy site, and if it were desecrated, the surrounding Islamic peoples would rise up. So the Temple Mount in Jerusalem has become a cup of intoxication for all nations, as prophesied by Zechariah. And Hamas in Gaza, Palestine, claimed that Israel was overlooking the Temple Mount. So they invaded Israel in October of 2023 to stop it. And so they had the support of the Islamic world in the Middle East. But as the war has dragged on, the world has become increasingly anti-Semitic with the anti-war movement. But the fundamentalists in the Israeli authorities are not backing down, saying that they believe it's God's will to build the third temple on the Temple Mount, and that Hamas must be rooted out. And so we're seeing more anti-Semitic sentiment. The idea is that one day, when anti-Semitic sentiment reaches its peak, Jerusalem will become an immovable rock for all nations, fulfilling Zechariah's prophecy that all who try to move it will injure themselves. This could be an important marker of the end times timeline. On the day that all who try to move it will injure themselves. Verses 12-15 say, "Their flesh will rot while they are still standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths." 15 says, "A similar plague will strike the horses and mules, the camels and donkeys, and all the animals in those camps." In other words, the eyes and tongues of man and beasts rot away in their sockets. If flesh rots away, eyes rot away in their sockets, and tongues rot away in their mouths. We can infer that this is the result of nuclear or chemical warfare. Highly toxic biological and chemical weapons burn and melt people instantly. In particular, this is what happens when a neutron bomb is detonated. In other words, a nuclear war could happen. Atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs are not used because their heat storms and radiation are too devastating. And neutron bombs, which only kill living things, are more likely to be used. Neutron bombs are the third generation of nuclear weapons, after atomic and hydrogen bombs, and are like small hydrogen bombs. Their explosive power and residual radiation is a fraction of that of the Hiroshima bomb. But the radiation they produce at the moment of detonation is so intense that exposure to neutron bombs breaks the DNA chains in the human body, causing cells to melt and decay, resulting in death within days. Neutrons are relatively penetrating compared to other radiation and will penetrate soil, concrete, and steel of any thickness. Therefore, the use of these neutron bombs would result in lethal killing of people and animals, even if they were hidden at a considerable distance. Second, the nations that come up against Jerusalem will be in a self-inflicted war. In verse 13 of today's text, it says, "On that day people will be stricken by the Lord with great panic. They will seize each other by the hand and attack one another." It means that the people of the nations who came to Jerusalem will fight each other and destroy themselves. In the book of Judges, Gideon's 300 men blew a trumpet in front of the Midianite army, broke open a jar and shook the torches in it, and they screamed and fled in fear. Judges 7:20-21, the 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars. Grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow, they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. Also, in Ezekiel chapter 38:21, which describes the war between Gog and Magog, It says, "I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares the sovereign Lord." Every man's sword will be against his brother. There are prophecies in the Bible that are waiting to be fulfilled in the future. In end-time prophecy, the 7-year Great Tribulation is at the center of it. It includes big events like the rapture, the age of the Antichrist filled with plagues and evil, and the return of Christ to sweep away the forces of evil. Importantly, we are the last generation living just before the 7-year tribulation. At that time, the earth will be burning with wars and disasters and overturned with plagues, and from an Israelite perspective. There will be those who suffer the 10 plagues, like the Exodus, and those who escape them, like the land of Goshen. But at the end of the 7-year tribulation, the nations of the world will come against Israel. We're already seeing signs of that. It is the rise of anti-Semitic sentiment. Anti-Semitism is the camp that supports the Palestinians. Today, anti-Semitism is widespread in the United Nations, NATO, and Islamic countries, and it is spreading to other countries. At some point, when anti-Semitism becomes a universal value, the nations of the world will unite to march their armies to Jerusalem. How can the world rally its armies to defeat just one nation, and why? Well, the Bible predicts that this will actually happen in the future. Most likely, it will happen as an ally of the beast. The nations that will join the beast's one world government at the end of time will be all the nations of the world. The evidence for this is found in Revelation 1:3-7-8. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language and nation. 8 All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb, who was slain from the creation of the world. It clearly says that all who dwell on the earth worship the beast. Then, in the world ruled by the beast, which is a world government, it will be a totalitarian control society. Revelation chapter 13:16. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads. Why will it be a control society that receives these marks? There are 2 factors. First, because of the defeat of the saints in the war between the Christian camp and the forces of the beast. The religious war against the Antichrist will take place during the first half of the tribulation, including the war of the 2 witnesses. Second, because the 7th trumpet plague will destroy 1/3 of the earth. And the environmental destruction caused by the war will cause famine with extreme temperatures, resulting in a global food shortage that will force people to join a one-world government that is said to control food. In addition, the 7 trumpet plagues were included when the 7th seal was removed. In the 7 trumpet plagues, there are hail and fire plagues that burn up 1/3 of the land and trees. Mountain plagues that are like large meteors on fire that turn 1/3 of the sea into blood and kill and break 1/3 of the sea creatures and ships. And a large star that burns like a torch falls from the sky and turns 1/3 of the rivers into bitter wormwood, killing anyone who drinks the bitter water. There are plagues that destroy 1/3 of the heavenly bodies in the sky. So the 1st through 4th trumpet plagues are plagues to the natural world and the universe. But now the 5th and 6th trumpet plagues are plagues to humans. It's a plague of yellow worms and a war plague involving 200 million horsemen that kills 1/3 of humanity. In a world devastated by these disasters and the plagues of war, there will be an extreme food shortage. So a world government will be established to implement a global food rationing system in the name of equitable food distribution. And the nations and people of the world will be forced to worship the idol of the beast and receive the mark of the beast for systematic management. At this time, those who do not like the mark of the beast will hide in the mountains or in secret places and will run from place to place to secure food. By the time most of the world's population has taken the mark of the beast, approximately 3 years will have passed, the end of the dragon and the 2 beasts will be near. At that time, terrifying signs will appear in the sky and the wine of God's wrath, the 7 plagues, will be poured out on the earth. Those who receive the mark of the beast will have poisonous boils and feel great pain. The seas will turn to blood and all living things will perish. The sun will become hot and burn people and destroy natural ecosystems. In this way, the land of the beasts becomes black and dark, and the Euphrates River dries up in a severe drought. In addition, the largest earthquake in the history of the planet destroys all the cities, and large hailstones fall, reducing the rubble to dust. The colorful city lights, music, goods, logistics, commercial facilities, and restaurants are all destroyed. From the devastated earth, the armies of the nations of the world will be summoned and gathered for the earthly alliance of the Antichrist, the government of the beast, and wage war against the armies of Christ in heaven. That is the war of Armageddon. As for the second coming of Jesus, the beast's government might say it's an alien attack, and they might call up the armies of the world to stop it. There's been a lot of information about aliens in the media lately, so there are a lot of people in the world who actually believe they exist. If Jesus were to supernaturally return to Earth in the clouds, the world could be led to believe that it would be an actual alien attack. It could even cause the world's armies to rally around the idea of defending the planet from aliens. But these are just possibilities and speculations. We'll have to wait and see what happens. Third, Jerusalem is an important place in Jesus' millennial plan. The temple in Jerusalem that the Lord builds during the millennial kingdom will fill the whole world with his glory. Isaiah 2:4. In the last days the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their words into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Psalm chapter 52. From Zion, perfect in beauty, God shines forth. Jesus' second coming to earth will see him accepted as the true king of the world and progressively accepted as king by all the nations. Jesus is the conqueror and the real Lord of the nations, but his greatest desire is for voluntary surrender. Eventually, at the climax of his return, Jesus will be received by the spiritual leadership of Jerusalem with welcome and deep cries of repentance. However, there will be a thorough judgment on those of the nations who rebel until the end. Revelation chapter 19:20 tells of Jesus' victory over and destruction of the Antichrist and the false prophet, the false king of the nations. The Antichrist and the false prophet are cast alive into the sea of fire at the beginning of the millennium. Revelation 19:20. Then I saw the beast and the kings of the earth, and their armies gathered together to wage war against the rider on the horse and his army. But the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet who had performed the signs on its behalf. With these signs he had deluded those who had received the mark of the beast and worshipped its image. The two of them were thrown alive into the fiery lake of burning sulfur. Satan is then cast out of Jerusalem as Jesus enters into a covenant relationship with and is accepted by the people of Israel. Revelation 20:13. And I saw an angel coming down out of heaven, having the key to the abyss and holding in his hand a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil, or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. He threw him into the abyss, and locked and sealed it over him, to keep him from deceiving the nations anymore until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be set free for a short time. Satan still has a purpose in God's plan, for there will be future generations of the earth who will succumb to Satan's temptations again at the end of the millennium. So, at the end of the millennium, Satan will be released for a short time because of the rebellion of many of the nations. His release is tied to the final judgment on those who reject God's leadership. The last enemies of God will be put under his feet, and the earth will be given completely to God, and the heavenly realms and the presence of God will be united under God's rule and for God. May you reject the deception of the beast, the Antichrist, and the false prophet. And may you remain steadfast in the way of the heavenly people who believe in and follow the one true Lord Jesus Christ, in the name of the Lord.